Hey, it's Jeff here from Bow River Trout Fitters. Today we're tying the Gallup's Barely Legal. We're using a number 2 2461 Daiichi hook, some olive flat wax nylon thread. We'll bring the thread back, lay down a base. We'll start by putting in the tail. Take a plume of white marabou. We like the tail to be at least the length of the hook, so I've made mine maybe a quarter of an inch longer than the hook itself. And then I'll use the marabou to build a little body into the fly. Next we'll add, in between the two plumes, we'll add a little bit of holographic flash. I'm just using the holographic clear. Nothing too eye-catching, just gives a nice flash every now and then when the sun catches it. We'll lay that in on the side, give it a few wraps, and then fold it over, run it down the other side, and we'll just cut that the length of the tail. So we'll finish off the tail with the olive marabou, placing that on top, and it'll be the same length, maybe slightly longer than the white marabou. We'll take a few turns to tie that in, and we'll take the marabou just up the other side of the hook, just to, like I say, build a little bulk into the fly. This will make a nice even body and helps us really puff up the chenille. We're using crystal chenille. This is a pearl size medium. We'll tie it in right at the tail, and then we'll wind our thread forward. Here's where we kind of eyeball the length or dimensions of our fly that we want to make for the proportions of the body. We're going to just do thirds. So third of the way down the hook, and then we'll start the process over. We'll start with the olive marabou on top, and I like to make it so that it's at least better than halfway down the tail. And this is quite repetitive, this part of the fly. So each one you'll see I just hold on the bottom marabou. It's a little tough with the vise in the way. I just hold the marabou on the side, get my measurement, and then tie it in. For this part of the fly, the back of the fly, we're going to use single stacks of marabou. When we get to the front, we're going to start to double them up just to make the body proportions a little bit bulkier on the front of the fly. And we'll repeat these steps. We'll take our crystal chenille, make sure we're not capturing any of the marabou fibers, and we'll just wind that forward. Each wrap will preen those chenille fibers to the back, making sure it's nice and concentric wraps, tight together, and then we'll tie that in with our thread, and we'll start the marabou again, maybe 2/3 of the way up the previous stack with the next stack. This will give us good coverage. When this fly gets wet, it'll really start to undulate and open and separate, and you'll see those waves of marabou in the fly. We'll put our bottom stack on. And here we're going to be careful when we do this next step of the fly. We're going to be careful not to get too close to the eye of the hook. We don't want to rush the head of the fly, so that we have a good lots of visibility on our hook eye, so that when we put the connection wire through, it's not binding, and we get a nice articulated movement with this fly. So we'll wrap our chenille up. Like I say, we'll just stop short of the eye here, a little ways back. We still have to put on a stack of marabou. So I'm going to use my thread and build a spot to place this material. Same measurements as before, maybe 2/3 of the way back on the previous stack. And we'll tie that in and tie it short. Like I said, being careful to keep the eye of the hook open and not crowd that, cover it up. So once we get this bottom piece of marabou tied in, when it's tight quarters like this, you'll see I have to spin my thread, and it makes that thread lay back against my fingers. A little easier to get that initial wrap for the tie-in. So whip finish, put a little head cement on that, tighten it up. For the front hook, we're using a size 1. This is a Daiichi 2461. It's a 1 or a 1/0. For this fly, we're going to be using a fish skull. So you'll notice with the fish skull, it does have a keel on the bottom, and there's the skull material is actually a little thicker on the bottom to keel the fly to the bottom. So we just want to measure this, taking note of where we want the front of the skull to be with relationship to the eye. So we'll mark our thread there and proceed to wrap the thread back. Here we're going to use just a regular connection wire. I think this stuff is a 20-pound test. And we just need enough to go through the eye of the trailing hook, and then normally we'd run this through the eye of the front hook and bring it back. Using a fish skull, it just gets so crowded in there. We just tie this in and put a little glue on it. These things are locked in. I mean, they're not going anywhere. So make sure that we have this on top. Cut those wires back. Try not to build up too much bulk where the fish skull will go, so that you can fill that in later as needed. And then we'll use an elastic band, just hook it onto the vise somewhere, just to hold that back hook. This part here, the connection cover, once we get our glue down over the wire, we're gonna use just scrap pieces of marabou just to cover this connection, just to cover up the beads a little bit. So this, if you have some bad feathers in the bag, this is the place to use it. We just want it to extend a little bit into the front of the back hook. We don't want it to go too far back because it'll start to tangle in that back hook, and that can cause problems with tangles, and the fly doesn't swim as well. So I'll put one piece on each side. They're quite thin. I'll run the rest of the marabou up the side of the hook just to build a little bit of bulk. We'll wrap that in, cut it off, and then bring our thread back. I'm going to take a little more of that holographic flash, and I'm just going to tie it in. I'm going to run it down both sides. I've got, I don't know, 5 or 6 strands here, but I'm going to cut these fairly short, just a little bit longer than this connection material. So just sticks into the head of the back fly. Just run it down each side and then trim it. And you can trim it kind of jagged. You don't want them to all be the same length, but that'll be a nice little flash every time that fly wiggles or pauses in the water. So we'll tie in our crystal chenille again, printing those fibers back, each wrap, nice tight wraps as we come forward. And again, we want to section our front hook into thirds. We don't want to, we need to take into account the fish skull. So section in just from the back of the fish skull, or halfway into the fish skull back. We'll break that into thirds of the fly. Like I said, here in the front hook, we're going to use 2 plumes on top and bottom. So I'm tying in 2 olive plumes on top. And again, those will extend just over halfway into the back hook. And again on the bottom, same thing with the white marabou. We're going to do 2 plumes, and just 1 on each side of the top of the hook or the bottom of the hook, depending on which color we're doing. You'll see I don't bring that marabou all the way forward here. I just bring it to where I'm going to start the next stack of marabou, just to build a little bit of bulk for the crystal chenille. So again, we're going to wrap that nice and tight, make sure we don't capture any of those marabou fibers. We'll bring that forward, tie it off, and just repeat this again, bringing the marabou to the back, 2/3, half to 2/3 of the previous stack. Tie those in, make sure they keep them on top. Don't let them roll over to the side. This fly, when you hold it up, it should be quite a thin profile, especially with the marabou. It should be quite in line, each stack lined up behind the other. So here you'll see we're building a little more bulk. The body's getting a little thicker as we move forward. Here I've ran out of chenille, so I'll just tie in another little piece here and continue wrapping. So this is the section where we just need to be sure about our head. So we've got the fish skull. I'm just going to size it in. I know I have to put on another 2 stacks of marabou top and bottom, and I just wanted to make sure that that fish skull still fits. As we apply our materials here, you'll see I prepped the front of the chenille there to give myself a place to tie this chenille or this marabou in. Every time we put that on there, just keep in mind we want it nice and tight, because this is going to be the landing zone for our fish skull. So we want a nice tight thread wraps around the marabou so that we can get a nice fit with the skull. And this is a good spot. You know, if you have some real bushy feathers, the front of the fly, this is the place to save those for. Again, we measure this back just to go 1/2 to 2/3 into the previous stack. And we'll take our time here, just make sure that we get it tied in nice and straight, and trim that material, and then prep that landing area for this fish skull. Before we put that on, we're going to tie in our hackle, and we're going to run that right down the side of the fly. It should be the length of the fly, almost to the very tip of the tail. So when you're pulling feathers, pull them from almost the exact same spot. That'll make sure that they're the same thickness and the same kind of gauge of feather. So I'm just going to put a little bit of head cement here just to lock down the threads and prep for the fish skull. Here you could even add a little bit of flash. I haven't here, but this is Tyre's preference, if you want to add a little bit of flash in with that hackle. Now my fish skull is slid on, and I'm just building a little bit of a thread dam just in front of it. So I'll do a few wraps and then just a couple of whip finishes, and really use my fingers to drive that fish skull back. Now what we'll do is we'll take a little Zap-A-Gap, and we'll just put a couple of drops just down right on the eye of the hook. Let those sink down. Don't use more than 2-3 drops. What it'll do is it'll start to soak into your feathers, and they'll get brittle and break off. So, you know, with the thread dam on there, the fish skull is not going anywhere. Next, we'll put the eyes on. I'm just using a 1/2 drop of Zap-A-Gap underneath them. There you have it. That's the Barely Legal. You can get these materials and more at bullrivertroutfitters.com, or come down to the shop and see us. Thanks, and hope you like this fly.